promised by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord.
May be seated. Jeremiah God's word.
You know, we did great on the day I was ordained, having a big party, having great food. And I really want to encourage us that on July 3rd, to celebrate our nation's independence, and also an independence that reflects a greater independence that we have in Christ. Let's go all out again. Let's do this really, really well. There'll be a lot of people out in the park. In fact, if you want to help us get set up a little early to make sure we secure our space next week. Now, last year we had to do that because it was the 4th on a Sunday. But I think there will be a lot of people out here, and it's possible we need to get out here an hour earlier than normal. So if you're interested in helping us set up a little bit earlier than normal, please let me know. I'd love to secure a spot for us. I'm ashamed to admit this a little bit, but there's a small, brief 3-word sentence that often puts me on edge. It makes me feel uncomfortable when I hear it. And that sentence is, can we talk? As a pastor, I should love to talk to people, and I do. But that brief phrase, at least in my ears, signals trouble. It suggests I have done something wrong, that bad news is coming, or that someone has an issue with me. In the 2nd grade, I was a talkative kid. I interrupted a lot because I had all the right answers. That's kind of how I operated. And over the course of my 2nd grade year, my principal would often in the hallway say, "Jeremiah, come to the office. We need to talk." Now, I'm suggesting to you that my aversion to that little line goes deep and has roots even in my own childhood. So don't get me wrong. If you say lines like this, you want to hang out sometime, you want to grab a bite, I would love to get your counsel on a certain matter. These things don't bother me in the least. But that phrase, can we talk, for reasons I'm not even sure I can completely explain, makes me feel uncomfortable. And this is just my particular symptom of what I believe is a universal problem, and that universal problem is the fear of others, oftentimes called in churches the fear of man. And the deeper issue that we all have to various degrees in various situations is being too preoccupied with the judgments, choices, actions of others in relation to us. The fear of others manifests when we are restless the night before a performance review at work, when we anticipate being on the negative end or the confronting end of a hard conversation, when we fear the decisions of powerful people that are more powerful than we are at least. We fear what others might do, and this is called the fear of humanity. And no matter how many experiences where the job performance review goes better than expected, or we get better news than we had hoped, or someone isn't confronting us, or whether someone isn't actually trying to harm us in any way, no matter how many positive experiences we get when others interact with us, those few bad experiences cause us to feel, even in our bodies sometimes, a deep fear of others. And this fear has very negative ramifications. We become cautious, even unduly, around people we ought to trust. Anxiety related to our fears takes our sleep away from us, which I know what happens to you when you lose your sleep, by the way, dear friends. It makes us irritable. And fear of others can even leave us feeling stuck, not knowing which way to turn or what to do. Now, today's continuation of the story of Jacob, a man that is now also known by the name of Israel, shows an extreme case where fear of man is actually quite rational. Yet, the focus of my sermon today will not be primarily on why this man now named Israel's fear of Esau makes sense. That's not really on the radar today. My primary emphasis will not even be on the outcome of this story, because in fact the story is kind of anticlimactic if you've been following along. Rather, my hope today in telling you the story of Jacob in this situation is to leave you at the end of my message with your greatest weapon against the crippling fear of others. I want to make sure that you have that. So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to offer a brief retelling of the story, then a very simple message today. I'm going to give you your best weapon against fearing others. So here's the story. Recall that Jacob, son of Isaac, grandson of Abraham, and brother of Esau, left his father-in-law Laban's land to go back home with his wives, concubines, and 11 sons and 1 daughter. Last week we heard about Jacob's famous wrestling event where God renamed him Israel. Now before that, we had already learned that Jacob had a strategy to split his family in two as he approached Esau in case Esau attacked with those 400 folks, and that gave at least some of his family a better chance at survival. This was a real specter of danger. At this juncture, because we know Esau has wanted to kill Jacob in the past, Jacob is very vulnerable. And so I want to make sure that as we see this story, we see that Jacob is actually being courageous. As an aside, what we see in this account is that Jacob is the first one that goes and meets Esau. And that shows us that he has become the sort of leader he ought to be. For godly leaders, when they invite people to become vulnerable with them while they follow, go first into the dangerous situation. We see that as Jacob approaches Esau, he bows to him first. And if anyone's on the chopping block, Jacob will be first to be harmed. And that's amazing, isn't it? Jacob, the runaway, scared boy, has become truly a leader of a nation. But we're left to wonder what will happen. Will Esau strike Jacob? Will war break out? 400 men, it seems, are ready to go. It seems that they're ready to go for a fight. And frankly, what we see after that is, again, not that interesting to us, except for understanding what is actually happening behind the scenes. Esau runs to meet Jacob and gives him a big hug, kisses him, and weeps. Something has changed in the last 20 years. Time does not heal all wounds, but it has healed this one, it seems. Or better, perhaps because God has been working, God has healed these wounds. Now Esau has time to meet Leah first, then Rachel, and the rest of the family in order, all bowing down to them. And in this order, Esau thinks this shows a little too much, and the gifts were as well. So he asks, what's the meaning of all these herds and these flocks? And Jacob wants to reiterate, hey, I just want you to know that I need your favor right now. In fact, Jacob suggests seeing his face is like seeing the face of God now that Esau is favorable to him. This is Jacob's way of expressing that he sees the smiling face of God behind the embrace of Esau. Again, time can only do so much. If Esau had not been softened by God somehow, apart from the story that we have been reading, this could have gone very badly for Jacob. He doesn't know what's going to happen, but we have the privilege to see it go as well. Still, Esau refuses the gifts that Jacob wants to bring and says, you ain't the only one that's been getting rich in these last 20 years. In fact, Esau seems to be in some ways doing a little bit better at this time because his family is a little bit older and larger. Still, Jacob insists, Esau, please take this gift. And so Esau receives the gift, and he offers to accompany Jacob the rest of the way home. Jacob still, at that point, kind of realizes he's on shaky ground. He wouldn't mind some extra difference from Esau's crew. It's all nice that you're giving me these hugs and kisses, but those 400 men with swords are still there. Esau then offers to leave some of his men behind, again likely well-intentioned protection, but Jacob would rather take his chances at a great distance from this crew. So Esau, at this juncture, heads back to Seir. You know where Seir is and how to get there, right? What you do is you take a plane, and then you take a bus, and then you take a taxi to get to Seir, in case you need to get there sometime. I'm obviously joking. No, Esau is going to Seir, which is south of Jerusalem near a mountain range. And Esau, goes to Seir. Now Jacob eventually arrives at Shechem by way of Succoth. And if you don't know where those two places are, let me just tell you that they're at a great distance from one another still. Those are lots of S cities. All you really need to know is that Jacob is up north and Esau is far south. Now, did Jacob again deceive Esau and not really intend to go with him or see him again at all? The story doesn't tell us that. The truth is, we are left realizing that Jacob is still on guard around Esau. This peace that he has experienced, the blessing that he has enjoyed in this moment, he recognizes or at least believes is tenuous, and he's still on guard. Again, whether or not he outright deceived him is not the point. He just wasn't compelled, once he had settled, to uproot his family and head much further south. And of course, God did not lead him that way either. So we are left with these two brothers experiencing what we might call a tentative peace. Esau will only be mentioned again in Genesis to lay out the nations that will come from him. And this tentative peace, we might say, for the people that come from Jacob and the people that come from Esau, those people would be called Edom, will not always be perfect and sure. In fact, the people of Edom will sometimes oppose the people of Israel. During the reign of King Saul, for example, Edom is mentioned as an enemy of the nation of Israel. And years later, even after Saul, God brings a scathing rebuke of Edom through his prophet Obadiah. God promises to bring disaster to Edom, Esau's descendants, for mistreatment of Jacob's descendants, Israel. Why? Because when Babylon attacked Judah, Edom did nothing. They watched and they did not respond. Now, what's the point of that brief history of these two nations? It's simply to show that while we see a good outcome in our immediate story, the brotherly love is tentative. It's not perfect. It doesn't last forever. And I want you to know that the Jewish readers following this story would have known about the subsequent events. How even these nations that are represented by these two brothers at times were not as close as we might hope. And so this distance that they experience is great in the meantime for Jacob, and the story actually starts to revolve around again his family completely, and Esau gets sidelines. And the most important detail of all the aftermath of the hug, embrace, and kiss is that Jacob decides to settle in Shechem. That will be shown as important next week when we see all that happens in Shechem to Jacob's family and what they do to the Shechemites. What does this have to do with my sermon today? Not a lot of drama, really, if you think about it. I mean, we've been waiting for Esau and Jacob to confront each other, but there's no fighting, there's no shouting, no blood, no drama. I mean, this is no Jerry Springer situation here, folks. And just hugs and kisses and embraces and some casual family fake politeness. And all that build-up, all that fear of Esau ends up being a whole lot of nothing. And honestly, a lot of times in Scripture, God prepares His people for a battle that He basically just wins with what amounts to the snap of a finger. And that prepares us again to understand how God often works when it comes to the fear of man. Now, there are some problems that you might hear in your head, and that will be addressed. Now, let me end my storytelling by pointing out Jacob has courage. I want you to see that he goes to the front of the line without being foolish all the same. For he's still cautious about his brother, isn't he? He doesn't let fear cripple him, nor does he overlook a dangerous situation with a brave face. He is appropriately guarded, but he also moves forward with confidence. In short, I am coming from the perspective that he has a near ideal response given the circumstances. I don't think any of us could have done better. He's come quite a long way, hasn't he? Now, I want to suggest there's one major difference that enabled this for Jacob, and I want to not only suggest, I want to tell you, I want to make sure you understand that difference. It makes all the difference in the world for us when we're having to access a great weapon in our battle against the fear of others, which again, I believe is crippling, is unhelpful, is unhealthy. And I call it a weapon against undue fear of people. And here it is. And this is really what my sermon's all about. If you wanted to tell your good friend, hey, what was church about today? This is what it's about. God's weapon against undue fear of others is His presence for us. God's weapon against undue fear of others is His presence for us. And again, I'm coming from the perspective, I assume that you realize that you would like to not fear others so much. The symptoms of this problem are real, whether it's the painful peer pressure that we've known in high school, the desire to be accepted at your new workplace, the pressure to be seen as having the right positions, especially in these days in all the social matters that we debate. And these inappropriate concerns for validation can lead us to compromise our values, can lead us to all sorts of unhealthy choices if we're not careful. So we do recognize we want to be better at handling our fear of others. So we ask the question, how does God's presence help? Also, where do I see it in this passage? I told you a story, but you might be thinking, I didn't see a lot of God in that story. Tell me, where did you see God, Pastor? First of all, we see it when Jacob sees Esau's face favorably disposed towards him and says it's like seeing the face of God. That might be like your own expression, God is smiling on me today. It's probably an idiomatic expression of some sort. The truth is, God's presence with Jacob has not only been revealed in Esau's embrace, but it has been promised long before. And today's events are the culmination of God being with Jacob for many, many, many years, taking care of him, protecting him, and preparing him for what's next. In fact, twice God promises Jacob with his own lips to be with him and protect him. When God visits Jacob in that dream where the angels are ascending and descending from heaven, God says this, I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I've done what I've promised you. Genesis 28:15. When God calls Jacob to take his family from Laban, this is what is said by God to Jacob. Go back to the land of your fathers and your relatives, and I will be with you. Before Jacob arrives at this moment, God has fulfilled his promise to be with Jacob for many, many years. And God's presence is what enables Jacob to leave Laban and what enables Jacob to face Esau with a much larger army than he could possess without the crippling fear that so many of us know and experience. God's presence enables Jacob to face what he knows could be a bloodthirsty brother of his, and certainly more powerful, with great confidence. God is the one who made this possible. Now, I want to really, there's some real payoff in this, I think, and I hope you will see it that way too. Let me make a distinction for you. I didn't say the key to battling undue fear of others is to understand God's sovereign protection or believe in God's providence in your life. Now, obviously, don't minimize those things. I preach about them regularly. But my focus is more the mere intellectual grasping or even having faith itself. Jacob isn't merely strengthened by divine aha, but God with him as Abba, Father, for him. If God is not with Jacob in this moment, no amount of positive self-talk, no amount of good theology, or even deep faith will save him. Jacob is not saved simply by cognition of facts, though cognition is important. And though deep faith is absolutely essential, it is only as important as the object of faith. What matters most in this moment is that God is truly with him. God was with Jacob all those years while he was slaving away for his father-in-law Laban, though Jacob was largely blind to the fact. Faith is helpful and nice. Cognition is important. But really, what's going to save you in the end is God being with you and for you. And God is with him today. Cognition, sure. Faith, absolutely. Realization and good theology, absolutely important. But if your theology does not tell you that what you need most is God's presence in your life, then your theology isn't good enough. Jacob sees what is happening, and that strengthens his will and protects him. He finally has eyes to see, God, you've been there all along. Every word that you've ever said came true. And all I've been missing in all of this is you. The faith and the cognition that we need comes first and foremost, not through efforts, not even through intellectual prowess, but being able to sense and see God's hand at work. When you're able to look around you, and even without all the obvious evidence to know that God is moving, that is the biggest difference maker in understanding. You might say, well, Pastor, you seem like you're splitting hairs a little bit. Like, yeah, I know God has to be the one that saves me, but isn't cognition, isn't theology important? Help me understand why you're making such a big emphasis on God's presence with you is what drives away fear of others. Let me give you an illustration that it's humorous, perhaps, embarrassing, certainly, and hopefully you don't respect me less today than you did when you walked here. So back in the fall of 2010, I was driving my Toyota Corolla to meet Mesa, my wife, at a wedding for some family friends of her families. And I was driving, honestly, I can't even remember when. I tried to Google it, but I couldn't find the place. Somewhere near the Aurora, Naperville area. And sadly enough, while heading that direction, I missed my exit. I think I was using MapQuest directions at the time, but I can't even be certain. It's been a while, And as I take an exit to turn around and get back on track, I see the blue lights. Yeah, that's right. Pull over. And I'm asked for license, registration, insurance, the whole thing. Why? My brake light is out. You can boo for that. That's like, come on, man. I'm just trying to get to a wedding. Boo, yeah. And one more problem in that situation. He asked for the insurance card, and guess who didn't have it in the console?
Oh.
So the police officer, in his kindness, says, I will not give you a ticket for the taillight, but I have to cite you for the insurance card. That's just negligence. But I said, I'm insured. I just don't have the card with me. Then he said, that's fine. And he directed me to how to appeal the fine and to get it overturned. I just had to go to a courthouse somewhere out there near Naperville and Aurora. And I can't even remember again where that courthouse was. And because this ticket was slightly expensive, yet the fear of my insurance premiums going up, I realized I need to drive all the way out there. This was long before $6 gas, dear friends. It was worth the trip. And I decided to go out to the courthouse and prove that I had the insurance and get the ticket overturned. So I go to the court. And on the day of the ticket hearing, I'm in a room in some courthouse, and I pretty much know what's going to happen. I'm going to go present my documents, I'm going to get my citation overturned, and that will be that. The stakes were incredibly low. $100 fine, temporary increase in car insurance, worst case scenario, best case scenario, and that's the one that's likely. Everything should work out. But I tell you, dear friends, the minute that judge with that big black robe waltzed into the room and someone said, all rise, the bailiff said, all rise, and then banged on that gavel, I started to experience a trembling in that moment. Something was happening to me that was beyond mere intellect, something that was profoundly physical, and it was overcoming all that I knew, all my rationality in that situation. I was way too afraid of this judge, of this punishment, of what could happen at this moment. And so I was like, what's going on here? Why are you like this? Jeremiah, you know better than this. You should be ashamed of yourself, man. So I started telling me, don't you remember that God's in control? You're a pastor, for Pete's sake. Why are you afraid of this guy? And all the self-preaching did for me is actually made me more anxious because I started calling myself names. And I was like, yeah, maybe I am a wimp, actually. And what would happen if I were on trial for something more serious? And I was wrongfully accused and all the evidence was against me. Or what would happen if I were actually standing on trial for my faith? How would I handle it? I'm not up for this. And all these things that I'm experiencing and I'm feeling in my body, I cannot get a hold of, and I cannot tell you why. I cannot tell you why. So what did I finally do? I prayed. I prayed to God in the name of Jesus, who said He would be with me until the end of the age. And while praying, I didn't simply know that Jesus was with me. I felt and experienced Christ with me in that moment. And that rather silly fear did diminish in that situation. And what happened after that? Well, showing this insurance card and other documents worked. The judge said, see you later, make sure you're more responsible next time. I mean, all that built up bodily for nothing. And I knew that going in. And what I want you to know is that even though my situation, the end result was less climactic, I needed to realize that Christ was with me in that moment. I don't want you to walk away from that illustration saying that prayer fixes everything, though it does certainly heal many things. And I don't want you to hear me saying that oh, all you need is just a little prayer here and there. No. What I'm trying to tell you is that I don't even have it within myself to calm myself down apart from Christ's presence, even in small, silly things. All of this fear of others that we experience sometimes is actually quite irrational, and we know it. It doesn't even make sense to us. Yet it still affects our body. It still affects how we handle even small trials in life. And that's what I'm trying to help you understand. We need God in every single moment. Now, my illustration brings up two problems, one of which I said I would address earlier when life doesn't present us with such easy situations. The first problem I want to mention is that Jesus himself said, do not fear the one who can harm the body, but fear the one who can cast body and soul into hell. The second is that Jesus himself, when faced with his own trial, didn't get off so easily as Jacob did. And we are promised, if we follow Christ, to experience at least a measure of his sufferings and persecution. So let me take that first issue, the first question basically being about what about the command to fear the one who can cast body and soul into hell. Jesus in that moment isn't telling us to fear God's judgment if he is for us, but God's judgment if we are against him. There's even an appropriate fear of God that drives away the anxiety that we ought to have. This fear is the type of fear that's mixed with relief when we know God is on our side. A person who has a near tragic accident while driving feels a great sense of relief after the fact, while gaining a great deal of respect for the danger that they're in while driving a car. A glad reverence or fear characterizes them in that moment. Such is the fear that we are to have even as believers who have God on our side. We recognize that God, great and mighty, could have been against us. And so we're relieved always while also respectful and happy in his greatness. We ought to fear God if he is against us in a way that helps us to recognize, no, you will face his judgment. God will call all people to answer to him. At the same time, those who are with God know him as wonderful and great, but also for us and kind. But the more serious question to me today is what happens to us when the fear of others isn't unreasonable? I mean, Jacob's situation, to remind you, was, from his perspective, quite serious. What happens when it's not simply about higher insurance premiums and a small fine? I mean, when we face the loss of a job, respect by those we value, when there are costs to actually following Christ, how do we actually handle that? It's easy when you got small stuff like Pastor Jeremiah's little courtroom situation, but what happens when the city you live in is full of those that feel like your very beliefs are harmful and dangerous to them? Now let me again back up and point out that Jacob offers some helpful guidance here. His danger in this moment was serious, and he handled it well. He took the moment seriously and gravely. He made proper preparation, and yet he was robustly prepared for it because God with him. He recognized he might be walking through the valley of the shadow of death and felt God's presence even in that moment. And at the same point, I want us to understand that we are all going to face something much more serious than my courtroom. My point again in that illustration wasn't to make light of God's presence being very powerful in dark situations, but to criticize the idea that you can do anything, even the subtlest hint of threat, without him. We need God, especially in the darkest moments of our life. We need him even in the small ones. Even if God allows us to meet a terrible fate, it isn't the Esau's, the judges, the bosses, even the executioners of this world who ultimately are in charge, but God. And I want us to understand that. And if God is willing to take us through extreme difficulty, if he's willing to take you through the hardships that you fear others bring into you, God must be trusted to bring us out of them one way or another. And how do we get there, you might ask? How do we get to that point? I mean, you just said, Pastor, right when you were planning a church, I mean, you're supposed to be courageous in all this, and you're trembling in a courtroom. How do we get to the point where we're courageous when the fear of others really is rational, makes sense, and quite a serious matter? C.S. Lewis, in his really brilliant essay, The Efficacy of Prayer, efficacy is a fancy word for the effectiveness of prayer, helps us see that in the Christian life, we experience God's powerful presence, and over time, when we recognize God's powerful presence, like Jacob learned to do, that begins to help us handle the good and the bad. C.S. Lewis, in this particular essay, describes 2 miraculous healings that he encountered. 2 times where in his life he said, someone had something that no human could cure, and God did this. So Lewis began to ask the question that we all ask, well, why does God do it for some? Why does God help some people endure or go through an experience where everything's okay, and some people go through an experience where everything's not okay? And Lewis begins by quoting an older follower of Jesus who says this, I have seen many striking answers to prayer, and more than one that I was sure was miraculous. But these miracles usually come at the beginning, before conversion or soon after it. As the Christian life proceeds, they tend to be rarer. The refusals by God to intervene are not only more frequent, they become more unmistakable and emphatic. Lewis then asked the question, if that's the case, does then God forsake those he loves the best? Well, he who served him best of all said near his tortured death, why have you forsaken me? When God becomes man, that man of all others is least comforted by God at his greatest need. And Lewis says there's a mystery here which even if he had the power, he did not have the courage to explore. Meanwhile, he says, little people like you and me, if our prayers are sometimes granted, beyond all hope and probability, we had better not draw hasty conclusions to our advantage. And this is the key I really want to drive home. If we were stronger, we might be less tenderly treated. If we were braver, we might be sent with far less help to defend far more desperate posts in the great battle. I know that's a lot to chew on, but let me break that down for you and give you the implications. Lewis is claiming that part of how confidence in God's presence for us, how we recognize God's presence for us that drives away fear, is matured over time. It doesn't come to us immediately. The initial part of the Christian life is learning to see that God is with us and for us. And God helps us to see, like a newborn baby, that God's with us everywhere. And over time, although our eyes might not see what's true, we learn to sense it anyways. God is with us sometimes, even when we don't feel it. Even when you can't point and say, these are the circumstances in my life, and I know that God's there. In fact, many times in life, as we mature, things are falling apart, and we know that the mountains are falling into the ocean, and God is still with us, and we can say that when we're mature in Christ. Now, if you're clever, you might say, well, it's better to stay immature then. I don't want God to send me to hard places. I'm okay. I'm cool with God not letting hard stuff happen to me. But dear friends, let's not be so foolish. The persecution will happen. A person with great power in your life will not favor you. And this isn't to do with the fear of man, but it's related. The cancer is coming. So I commend you to learn. I commend to you, I do not command, but I commend you to learn not simply that God is present for you, that you might be ready for what lies ahead, but I want you to open your eyes and sense it now, because that's going to help you when you can't sense it. And it will help you when your life faces more significant trials and tribulations than small fines and insurance hikes. I don't want you to merely understand that God is supposed to be with you. I want you to feel it in your bones. I want the words that I preached a few weeks ago from Isaiah not merely to be words on a page, but your deep-rooted confidence. And even when you cannot prove it to others, and you can hardly prove it to yourself, that you could say with the prophet Isaiah this, He who created you, Jacob, He who formed you, Israel, do not fear, God says, for I have redeemed you. I have summoned you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. Why? Because anyone who has Christ, He has, and He will be with them, and He will go with them wherever they go, even to the grave and out of it. And I want that truth to go beyond the brain. I want it to go to the heart, and I want it to affect the entire body, even trembling hands. God will be with you in your greatest need. I promise you that. I just want you to sense it today. So what I want to do right now is I want to pray. I want to pray, and I want to take some time, and I want to give you a moment, actually, 2 or 3 minutes, to pause, consider. It's nice outside. Where are you going to go that's better than this right now? I mean, I don't know. I like it right here. And I want you to take 2 or 3 minutes and ask yourself a hard question. Who am I afraid of? What do I fear? How is it manifesting in my life, the fear of others? Maybe you write it down, in fact. Note it. And then ask God to show you His presence for you in those situations in life. So let's take some time, and then I'll close this out with some prayer that will guide us to respond to that.